Welcome to ADD Brain Type Week. We're so excited for this week. Tana and I often say we know more about ADD than we want to know. And we are going to explore the 7 different types of ADD at work, at school, and the impact at home. So stay with us. It's going to be fun and fascinating.
I want to start with a testimonial. This is from my YouTube channel, but it's about our podcast. So again, Daniel and Tana, well spoken. Thank you for the real tangible help you have to offer laypersons and professionals from your experiences as well as your educated intelligence, proven studies using the original medicine given to all. Like first responders are taught how to break the tunnel vision, panic, and anxiety. Really like that. So that's from Laura Louise Doctor.
So ADD.
Yes.
I knew nothing about it before I went to medical school.
I thought it was just a joke.
But growing up, I sort of had an ADD brother who's so active, beat me up all the time. And he would get out of the house sometimes, and my mother would find him in the gutter on the street. When she put him in the corner, he would actually start taking the wallpaper off the walls. And he didn't do that well in school.
Right.
In fact, because of him, I had to change high schools because we were going to a college prep school, Crespi, in the San Fernando Valley, and he wasn't doing really well. So my mom, after my freshman year, carted me off to Birmingham High School, which I was like so okay with because they actually had girls,
yeah.
there. But ADD affects at least 10% of the population. And if you have ADD, it affects probably 30% more.
Right, because it affects the people in your life.
Because it affects their husbands, their wives, their teachers, their bosses, the police.
Right. Yeah, I wonder what the percentage of ADD is with the criminal population in jails.
It's very high.
Yeah.
It's like 25%, up to
That's
50% in some studies.
Oh.
But also when you look at head trauma, it's also very high.
Yeah.
And so it's one of the unknown reasons why people's lives don't go the way they had hoped.
But talking about the types, I think that part might confuse some people because there are different types. And I think that's really important because not everyone behaves the same on ADD. And I think that confuses people. And I think that's where we start going, it's nonsense, right? So I know when you scanned me, I had a little bit of like sort of sleepy frontal lobes, but they weren't extreme like someone like my mom. But my behavior was not typical for someone with classic ADD. So that's where you start going, how come some people behave very classic? Some people have some traits, but not everything.
So do you remember our first date? And I guess it's about 70% through the date. You looked at me and you go, you think I have ADD,
right.
Don't you?
Because I was drinking like almost 2 pots of coffee a day. I work in a trauma unit. I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning to work out. But see, to me, getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to work out was a health, like I thought that was a good thing. Right. So I'm not seeing, I graduated top of my class. I mean, I could do all the other stuff where, I did really well in school. I had all these other things that I was doing that, financially I was fine. I was actually more than fine. So I wasn't late paying bills. You know what I mean? All these other things, these classic traits that people have, I didn't have.
Yeah. No, you have anxious ADD, but waiting in line.
Oh, no. No, I'm not patient with other people, especially people with ADD. So I'm not patient at all. So is that a sign of ADD?
Or being organized.
No, I'm very organized with what I want to be organized with.
Right, but everything else you're not.
But I don't care. So
before we get into the types, let's spend this first podcast just talking about, what ADD is. And you brought it up on the imaging work we do, but also, lots of other people have found that it's basically lower activity in the prefrontal cortex when you try to concentrate. Also goes with lower basal ganglia activity, which usually means lower anxiety, and it goes with lower cerebellar activity, especially when you try to concentrate. And the hallmark symptoms of ADD that applies to all of the types: short attention span. That's why it's called attention deficit disorder, but not for everything. It's short attention span for regular, routine, everyday things: schoolwork, homework, paperwork, chores. And the thing that fools people, and this is often why it has a bad reputation, for things that are new, novel, highly interesting, stimulating, or frightening, people with ADD can pay attention just fine. So those things have their own internal
but
dopamine.
college isn't new, and
But if you are driven to be at the top of your class, then that's the dopamine that causes you to perform. But when it comes to closing a cabinet door,
but I'll go back and close
putting,
it. I'll get back around to it.
or putting a wrapper away, it's like you don't really
care,
even see those things.
Don't really care.
and before you really decided you wanted to do well in school, you struggled early on.
No, actually, as a young child, I did.
As a young child.
But until I was in like 3rd, 4th grade, then I started to get better.
Right.
But
now part of it was the
I was very
chaos.
young. And I was very young. I was the youngest in my class.
Was the chaos. And that's a very important point. The children who are the youngest in their classes
my birthday was the cutoff.
actually have a much higher incidence of ADD. Because
Why?
if you think about it, so you started when you were 4.5.
Yeah, my birthday
So
was December 1st. It was the
there
cutoff.
are often kids in your class who are 5.5.
Oh, no, they
or
were like a year older than I
almost
was.
6.
Yeah.
So they're 20% older than you are.
Right, they've had more development.
And their brains have been more developed. And so that all by itself increases the chances that you'll be diagnosed with ADD and on medication. So
I
we
remember
are
being lost.
often, I'm like, start kids late. The later you can start them, the better they will actually do in school, in sports, with friends, and so on. But let me finish how we diagnose this. Short attention span, but not for everything. And, and I've known you for, over 13 years. If you're really interested, your attention span's great. If you're bored, it's terrible.
Well, I don't want to do it.
You won't want to do it. The second one is, so short attention span, easily distracted. And people who have ADD tend to see too much. They tend to hear too much. They tend to feel too much. They can even tend to taste too much and become sensitive with what they eat. But they have trouble sort of
Filtering.
decreasing the noise around them to stay focused on what they're doing. It's like the world
I have a
comes
question.
at them.
Is that why
too
we
fast.
sometimes like to blast rock music when we study?
Yes, because it's decreasing the
It does.
other
Yeah.
noise. It's also why they often like to sleep with fans at night. It's why they sleep with a mask at night. And sometimes, and this is going to sound strange, it's actually why sometimes people with ADD have trouble having orgasms. Why? Because what does an orgasm require? Attention.
Interesting.
Freedom of distraction, so you can focus on the feeling.
So you've given me ADD. I sleep with a mask because you keep your light on reading. Just FYI. So
All right, short attention span, we have to finish. Short attention span, easily distracted. And these are the kids who have sensory overload often. And so as little kids, they're taking their clothes off all the time because they hate tags. Michael Jordan, who said he had...
But I still do that when I walk in the door. I'm like, ah! I need to get into something like that does not
Michael Jordan actually
constricted.
for Hanes helped market tagless T-shirts.
Yeah, I despise the feeling of clothes.
You know,
still,
we think he had ADD when he was a student, and probably still does. But so
clothes feel like
clothes
a straight
bother
jacket,
them, tags bother them, seams and socks bother them. They're just more.
See,
sensitive.
I'm just having a hard time with some of these being a label for ADD. To me, some of them seem like common sense.
It's all, you have to put it all together, and it has to interfere with your life. Short attention span, distractibility, disorganization. So space, you do better when someone helps you organize. You just do. I mean, to say anything besides that.
But I do fine when someone's not.
All right. I actually don't know what to say to that, except I've lived with you for a long time. And often they're disorganized for time. They don't get how long things will take with them. So they tend to do things
that's not me.
At the last minute.
That's not me. I'm the opposite.
But that's because you have a subtype we're going to talk about called anxious ADD. And then procrastination is very common. They put things off until someone's mad at them to get it done. And impulse control. They'll often say things.
That's not me unless I'm in traffic.
Which means they're often not good at listening. So they'll interrupt you frequently. And the moment is what matters to them, not 5 moments from now or 10 moments from now. It's now. And that means they're spontaneous, which can be a really great thing. But it can also get them into trouble, where it's like, oh, I didn't really need to say that, or I didn't really need to do that. And
so I have a question then. So can it be that people who are not quote unquote or diagnosed with ADD have ADD moments? Because there are a lot of times you say silly things and you're like, it's like almost a joke in our house. You sometimes say things, you're like, can people have ADD moments?
All of us have ADD moments, right? It's if these 5 traits, short attention span, distractibility, disorganization, procrastination, and impulse control issues, if they really are the story of your life and they interfere with your life. So all of us, especially with social media and all the distractions in our society, have a short attention span and are easily distracted. But it's having these 5 symptoms over a long period of time that interfere with your ability in relationships, with your ability at work, your ability to manage your internal life. That's when we say you have ADD. And when I first started our brain imaging work, because I thought ADD, well, actually, for a long time, we've known it was at least 2 things. It's the classic time where you have those 5 symptoms plus you're hyperactive. Or you have those symptoms and you're never hyperactive. So we call that initially ADD with hyperactivity or ADD without hyperactivity. When I started looking at scans in 1991, I went, whoa, it's way more complicated than that. So stay with us, and we're going to begin to explain the 7 types of ADD. Welcome back. We're in the middle of ADD Brain Type Week, how ADD can affect you at home in your relationships, at school, and at work. But before we get to that, I want to read one of the reviews for the podcast from Alicia Garcia. I don't get how she manages, this is Tana, being a nurse, getting a second-degree black belt, being a mom, and being an inspiration to the world.
And having ADD, according to you.
And she's energetic and happy about it instead of breaking down. Like, who literally gets home from a demanding job and then decides to be Karate Kid for a couple of hours?
Well, first of all, martial arts is my therapy. There's nothing more therapeutic than going and hitting stuff, just FYI. And you're going to say that's because of my ADD, and I don't care. It just feels amazing. But I also have a lot of support. But right, we're a support team. We are a team. So it helps a lot.
So I think we need therapy because you have a subtype called anxious ADD. And the anxiety you feel causes you to suppress some of the ADD symptoms. But there's no question in my mind, if somebody would have treated it early, you'd be the chairman of the Department of Medicine at Harvard.
Yeah,
because you're so smart that having, and what's even more important for you, I think, is being raised in a broken home by a flaming, and I love your mother, flaming ADD mother.
It's true.
And having a dad that was distant and depressed.
And just completely disconnected. He wasn't there.
If you would have been raised in our home, Lord only knows what you would have done. And you've done amazing. And I married you, which means I'm not trying to fix you. You're my partner for life, we often say, right? The only reason you're running is if
death
you're
do us
chasing me.
Let's be clear, till death do us part. No, but let's have a candid moment for 1 second, because we're joking around in the last episode. I've actually often wondered, until I really started to understand how this works, because I do feel like I actually do pretty well with my life. I'm actually very happy with my life. I feel like I've accomplished a lot. My favorite thing is being a wife and a mother. Out of all the things I do, that's my favorite thing. But I feel like I've done a lot. I feel very accomplished. But there are times that I wonder, wow, like I feel like I did not really start to meet my potential until 38 years old. And when I started to figure that out,
your ADD treated.
Right. And I really didn't understand. I was paying my bills on time. I was graduating from college, but I didn't even really know it was a struggle because I was so used to struggle. My entire life was a struggle from the time I was little. So, you know, there's this poster of this lion roaring, and he's like, I've been fighting to survive since I was a child. Like, that's what I always felt like. Right.
And since you have your ADD treated, how many books have you written?
Well, if you count the journal, it's 10. But if you don't count the journal, it's 9.
All right. So moving on. But actually, this is a very important point. Nobody wants to be labeled.
Right.
Nobody wants
it's hard
to be
you get
thought
defensive.
of as defective
right.
or abnormal. But everybody wants a better brain. And if we think of this as brain health, rather than you have a mental illness, you're just more likely to get help because you want a better brain. Who doesn't want
Well, and here's
a better
the deal.
brain?
We all have something. Okay? Like everybody.
How many people you know that don't have anything?
None. Okay? So just embrace it. Like, lean into it. Because here's the deal. Here's something that I want to just point out. We just said my mom's got flaming ADD. I mean, from hell. She's got ADD from hell. She's also one of the most amazing women I've ever met in my life, right? Okay, so this is a woman who didn't graduate from high school. She was a 16-year-old runaway, grew up in a really, really difficult home, really difficult situation. She's also an incredible entrepreneur, okay, which tends to go with ADD. So she didn't go to college, didn't finish high school, and she always said to me, I have no choice but to start a business. She didn't start one because she wanted to. She started one because no one would hire her. So she started a business because she was very strong-willed, very intense, and no one was going to hire someone who didn't graduate from high school. So she started her own business, and she's worth more than what? She's in the top, 1 or 2% in the country? So the woman is a powerhouse, and she's an entrepreneur, and she's creative. So we have to sort of pay some tribute to that.
Well, and many people who have ADD are highly successful.
Right.
So Terry Bradshaw has talked
Surgeons.
about his ADD. Justin Timberlake has talked about his ADD. So
but even people in the medical
the guy
field.
that owns JetBlue talks about his ADD.
In the military,
so
it's rampant.
It's getting it treated so that you can take the energy that you have
and channel
it and do the things you're really good at and farm out the things you're not really good at.
Right, and that's the thing I learned.
Because that's a sign of intelligent
That's the thing
life.
I learned. Thank you. You just said it. That was the thing I learned, was I don't have to be good. That's why I was joking in the first episode when you said, you don't do this, you don't do that, you're not good at this part, that. I'm like, because I learned I don't really care. I don't have to be good at everything. But I'm going to focus on what I'm good at, and I'm going to find people to help me with the things I'm not. That's the sign of intelligence. So that's the sign of successful people.
All right.
But
so before we get too far off, we have to dive into the types, and then we can talk about each of these things with the types.
Okay, so don't forget, I want to come back to, let's talk about when we get to that part, why are certain people who seem incredibly successful, like surgeons, why are so many of them in certain fields, why do they have a higher incidence of ADD?
So it tends to be trauma surgeons, and emergency room doctors, because they have low dopamine levels.
Which I was a trauma nurse.
So they, you're so funny. They need excitement in order to be able to focus. So high incidence among firefighters as well. So when I first started doing imaging, I found it wasn't one thing. So there's classic ADD, that's type 1. It's what people think of: short attention span, distractibility, disorganization, procrastination, impulse control. Plus, they're hyperactive. They're restless. They're impulsive. They have trouble sitting still. While they're in class, they're eating something.
I did do that.
just to I've got to keep busy.
No, for me it was like I would get bored. Yeah, I'd fall asleep. Yeah.
And so falling asleep in class is a very common thing. But it's the hyperactivity. I have people say they can't sit through boring movies. If it's not somebody's dying every 3 seconds.
Okay, really? You just said that just because. Bad guy has to die in a movie for me to be happy.
Yes, that's a whole psychological thing by itself. But so classic is the hyperactivity plus the attention plus the impulse control issues. And though boys who have this are diagnosed early and they're medicated. Girls who have it are not so much diagnosed.
Why are they overlooked?
Because we have gender bias in this country. That if a little boy is having problems, the parents get very worried because they believe he's going to have to take care of a family someday. And
this can't still be going on. This can't still be happening.
Absolutely, goes on.
This is not acceptable.
I didn't say it was
not acceptable. Listen to me if you're listening to our podcast. This is not acceptable.
But if a little girl is having problems, they think she's not that smart.
Not acceptable.
And they hope she marries somebody nice.
Oh my God. Don't even say rich. I will seriously knock you off your chair. Don't say it.
I didn't say rich. But it's that mindset.
My skin is crawling.
I remember when I was growing up, I always thought I was going to college, even though my dad nor my mom went to college. But my dad told all of my sisters they didn't need to go to college.
I was told the same thing, by the way.
And in a lot of parts of the world, that still goes on. That there's gender bias. And the reason I bring this up is boys are actually diagnosed 5 times more than girls. But when you actually screen them for all the types of ADD, boys have it more, like twice as much as girls. So girls remain dramatically underdiagnosed because they tend to be more the inattentive type, which we'll talk about in a minute. And they tend not to have as much testosterone. So they are less of a behavior problem. So they're less likely to bring negative attention to themselves.
Yeah, that would have been horrifying.
And because of that, girls also have a higher incidence of both limbic ADD and anxious ADD. And so they don't get diagnosed. So they are condemned to live a life of mediocrity and not get near their potential. And they hate themselves for it because they know they could be better. So self-esteem is actually the difference between where you think you should be with your potential and where you are. And so if you're close to where you are, you feel pretty good about yourself. But if you believe your potential's here, but you're performing here, you hate yourself. And so girls are dramatically underdiagnosed. And the most common way women are diagnosed is they have a hyperactive son. And they bring their son here. And when, if it's a smart doctor and you really think a child has ADD in one form or another, you begin to look at mom and dad. And you go, so who's got it? And so Caitlin, my third child, who I adore, who we just had dinner with, who's a great mom.
Great mom.
And she had classic ADD from before birth. She was so active inside her mother's womb. We thought she was going to be a boy, but she wasn't. And trying to hold her when she was a year old was like trying to hold a live salmon. She was so active, and she kept climbing out of her crib. I'm like, what are you doing? I actually went and found a net that I put on top of the crib, and every night I would zip her in as she would grab the sides of the rail and shake it to go to bed at night. And so hyperactive, I had a spiritual crisis because of this child.
Yeah.
Catholics, why they do this, God only knows. God probably don't even know, is, they bring children into church with them. And when I was little, I'd go to church. There'd be 7 of us sitting in a row with my brother bothering me. And she was so bad in church, is so active and blurt out in the middle of mass, and I'd take her out and threaten her life. And then I realized, well, that's a bad thing because she's not going to go to church when she's older, because you go to church to get your life threatened. And it was bad for business because I'm like the only child psychiatrist in the county. And if your child's the worst one, it's bad for business.
But you're bringing up a very good point, because So think about it, because we said we're going to do this through the lens of home, work, whatever. So I have two half sisters, and one of them behaved really well when she was young. The other one was kind of a nightmare. And so the one that was a nightmare basically got beaten. I didn't grow up with her; she's my half sister. But I remember my stepmom breaking spoons over her. My dad, beating this child with a belt. She just would not listen. I don't care what you did. This kid was not going to listen. Climbing out of her crib. She was one of the worst kids I've ever seen. The other one stayed out of trouble when she was little. Now that changed when she was older, but when she was little, she was good. So the parents not only felt a tremendous amount of guilt for losing their tempers with her, which those kids can cause parents to lose their tempers. And everyone thinks, you should never lose your temper. I've seen some of these kids cause parents to lose their tempers.
Well, they do that purposefully.
Right.
Now, it's not conscious.
Right.
It's Pavlovian, which means they're getting benefit from it and they don't know why they react. So the classic ADD child, they're excitement seeking or conflict driven.
Well, there's another.
So they play this game called Let's Have a Problem.
Right.
They don't know they do it, but if they have a bad morning at home,
right,
like mom screams and cries and threatens their life,
which happens every day,
then they have a good day at school.
Right.
But if they have a good morning at home, they often have a bad
So
day
I want
at
to give you an
school.
example. So listen. So the other thing is it caused guilt with the other sister. A lot of guilt growing up because she didn't get beaten. Okay, so that ended up causing problems for her. But here's a really interesting thing that happened. When she was 12, I remember my dad was divorcing my stepmom. And my stepmom called me and she's like, I cannot handle these kids. Can you please come take the younger one for the weekend? And I'm like, I'm her sister. I was like 10 years older than her. But I'm like, what? I was, it sounded weird to me. But I'm like, okay, she needs a break. So I remember I drove up there and I picked her up. And she was pretty hard to deal with. And she gets in my car. I literally got 3 or 4 miles from the house where I picked her up. And she started in with me the way she does with her mom. I didn't say one word because I'm like 21, 22. So I'm not very patient. Didn't say one word. And I scared the heck out of her because I guess I spun a U-turn, and which in a very aggressive way. Drove back to the house, slammed on my brakes, got out of the car, threw her bag out of the car, and I went, get out. And she goes, what? I go, get out of my car. I'm not your mom. Get out. I'm done. And she literally was the best kid for the rest of the weekend. I'm zero trouble with her. So you have to kind of wonder why. Did it stimulate her? Did it?
Because she's scared of you.
She's not scared of me. I didn't do anything to her.
Are you kidding?
I did nothing to her.
Half the world is scared of you.
No, they're not. I didn't do anything. My question is seriously from a biological and psychological standpoint. Why does she listen when that happens?
When we come back,
You
we're
didn't
going to
answer my
talk
question. You didn't
about
answer my
the
question.
conflict-seeking, scary nature of somebody who has ADD. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are having an ADD podcast. We're talking about ADD types at work, at home, and at school. We've talked about type 1, but we didn't talk about how to fix it or how to treat it. We will in just a second. This is from Who Let House. Wow. What a wealth of complimentary information, motivation, and encouragement to live your best life. Dr. Daniel and Tana Amen generously share an abundance of resources to both point you in the right direction and keep you on the path.
Oh, thank you.
That's exactly
Like it.
what we do. And for so many people who have ADD, we hope they find this fun and empowering. And I love the story of you and your sister, that when she was acting up, what you did, besides scare the heck out of her, was immediately place boundaries on what was acceptable and what wasn't. And the consequences of it were painful in that she loved you and wanted to spend time with you, and realized if she was going to do that, you would only tolerate good behavior. And by increasing her anxiety, you actually helped her behave better.
Oh, so her parents yelling at her stimulated her but didn't increase her anxiety in an effective way.
Correct.
Is what you're saying.
Right. That
Okay.
they were
Because she's used to that.
ineffective
Right.
at doing that. And screaming is an ineffective way of stimulating people who have ADD. In fact, I teach all of my patients don't yell. Because if you yell, they're going to make you yell again. They actually get addicted to the conflict. So one, it's bad for the parents who are yelling because they end up feeling guilty, and because they feel guilty, they go into a cycle of guilt. So which is, I yelled, I feel bad, therefore I let I let them do bad behavior, or I don't deal with it because I feel bad that I'd exploded, and then they do more bad behavior and you don't deal with it, and then they do more bad behavior and then you scream.
Right.
Or you beat them. And the idea is stop screaming, but consequences,
Have to be big.
well, they just need to be significant,
Right.
depending on
That's
the age.
what I mean. Significant's a
depending
better word.
on the age. And it fits perfectly with what we talked about with Jim Fay on parenting with love and logic, that I don't do things for people who aren't nice to me. And you modeled that perfectly with your sister. She's acting
Yeah,
up.
I could have done it a little more maturely if I had been older and had some practice.
But you were 21.
Right.
And, you reacted in the moment.
Right.
So people have classic ADD, they have sleepy frontal lobes, and stimulating those either with a higher protein, lower carbohydrate diet, with stimulating supplements like rhodiola, L-tyrosine, ginseng, or using stimulants like Adderall, Vyvanse, Concerta. I'm actually a huge fan of those for the right brain. You're going to see in a little bit, it's clearly not right for everybody. And people just do so much better when you balance their brain. But they also do better in jobs they love. So they do better as emergency room doctors. I've actually not met one classic ADD dermatologist.
Yeah, to me the idea...
There's no stimulation in rashes
Well, and here's
or
the thing. The
pimples.
idea of sitting in a cubicle, oh my gosh, which is interesting. I became a writer later, but I think it's because I loved the idea of being a mom so much. So I learned how to channel that energy and do other things like martial arts to stimulate myself instead of, but sitting for long periods of time doesn't typically...
And what do you say your therapy is hitting things?
Right. Oh, it's the best. It's just the best.
All right, so that's classic ADD. And so in boys diagnosed early in school, they're often troublemakers. They're pushing against authority, although people would say I have that.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And at work, they have trouble sitting still. They often make great salespeople because they go from thing to thing.
Oh my gosh, my mother, you could say no to her 25 times. It's like she has Teflon on. She doesn't even hear you. Doesn't hear you. She's going to get that sale.
But doing their paperwork, the IRS loves these people because they pay fines.
Yep.
Which is why if you have classic
and they end up in more
ADD
lawsuits.
at work, they do because of the impulsivity. If you have classic ADD, it's really great to have, and you run a business, it's great, hire an executive secretary.
Who's a little more anxious.
That does not have ADD.
Right.
Has a little OCD.
They don't
that
have
will
good
follow
follow-through. Right.
For you. And then, and this has been described a long time, it wasn't me, inattentive ADD. So short attention span, distractibility, disorganized, but they tend, where classic ADDers tend to be more extroverted, inattentive ADD tend to be more introverted. They have excessive daydreaming. They're not hyperactive, and said they may be a little hypoactive. And, sometimes described as sort of a slug with little motivation. And it impacts girls more than boys. They still have this low activity in their brain, but they get diagnosed way less.
Because they're not noticed.
Because they are not troublemakers. And although the classic ADD in girls, this is how you diagnose it. They're teenagers, and they fall in love. So they get the dopamine from falling in love. And that wears off after 2 weeks. And then they start fighting with the person they're attached to, because they're getting dopamine from fighting. And the other person gets tired of that, so they break up. And then there's all this drama around breaking up. And then 2 weeks later, they find another guy or another girl. And there's the stimulation from falling in love. And then they fight, and then they break up. And if this is happening 3, 4, 10 times a year, that really is one of the indications of ADD. It's like anybody who's just like next, they should be screened.
Yeah, that's
for
actually a
ADD.
pretty unhealthy cycle you want to start paying attention to.
Right. And you've seen that among a number of your friends.
I've seen that among among a number of Chloe's friends already.
Right.
Yeah.
So, all right. Inattentive ADD, we treat it the same way. We use stimulants or stimulating supplements, a higher protein, lower carbohydrate diet. One of the best ways to treat ADD is intense exercise. And often, I remember I treated this attorney who had ADD. And his office was just a mess. And his assistant had ADD too, so it was not a good combination. But he had to exercise every day for a couple of hours.
So?
And
So
there's
what is
actually
your point?
brand new study. You don't know this. I just read it. Brand new study. The perfect amount of exercise is about 60 minutes a day. For women who exercise more than that, there's not a longevity benefit. It actually goes the other way.
Yeah, now I do
it's
an
too
hour.
much stress.
Now I do an hour, but I used to do 2.
Because it's too much stress. But a lot of people use exercise to either treat their depression or to
both.
treat their ADD. So when they get hurt, their life just falls apart because they're
yes.
not medicating with the serotonin and dopamine and the endorphins that you get from exercise.
I completely panicked when I got thyroid cancer and I had surgery. I panicked. That's how I knew there was something going on.
So the inattentive ADD people at work, they're not getting stuff done. Or it's still at the last minute, and it really can negatively affect them, and it can negatively affect their team. Type 3 is what we call overfocused ADD. We have too much activity in a part of the frontal lobes called the anterior cingulate gyrus. It's the brain's gear shifter. And then low frontal lobes in another part. And so they have traits of being impulsive and distracted and compulsive. So these are the people who have the ADD symptoms, plus they're worried, rigid, inflexible. If things don't go their way, they tend to get upset. They're argumentative. They hold grudges. They often get diagnosed as having oppositional defiant disorder. So I always joke with Caitlin, her first word was no. Her first short phrase was no way. And her first long sentence was, "You can't make me do it." So it's like classic. We see overfocused ADD in children and grandchildren of alcoholics. So if there's a significant alcohol or drug history in your family history, they often medicate themselves with alcohol to calm down.
But isn't exercise also, don't these people also gravitate?
They do, and it's perfect for them because exercise boosts serotonin.
Right.
And
dopamine.
Right. But they also can struggle with obesity because sugar boosts serotonin, right?
And comfort foods are common for.
Yes. And at work, these are the people that no matter what it is you say to them, they argue with you. And the sort of dog with a bone thing, and they won't let it go, even though it's in their best interest to let it go. So we want you to be persistent and assertive, but also in a way that takes into consideration the feelings of other people. And so this type does, well, actually, one of my first books I wrote, 1994, it's called Healing the Chaos Within. It's about children and grandchildren of alcoholics and how interventions to raise both serotonin and dopamine transform their lives in a good way. So it used to be Prozac and Ritalin. It was just miraculous for some of them. And then, since I went to more natural treatments, we'll use 5-HTP and saffron to boost serotonin, and rhodiola and ginseng to help boost dopamine.
Interesting.
And exercise is amazingly helpful. Now, they do better with a balanced diet. Type 1 and Type 2 do better with a paleo diet or Atkins diet, a higher protein, lower carbohydrate diet. This type, you actually make them mean if you.
So interesting. Chloe does not have ADD. If anything, she's kind of the opposite of ADD. She's a little more on the anxious side. But
and overfocused.
She tried to do, at one point, she wanted to do the ketogenic diet. She thought it would help her focus with school. Her anxiety just, oh my gosh, it was so hard to turn it off, so hard to get her to just settle down with anything.
And her rigidity.
Oh, dear Lord. So we figured out she needs more carbs, healthy carbs.
Healthy carbs.
Yeah.
All right, stay with us. We're going to talk about 4, 5, 6, and 7 coming up. Welcome back. We're talking about ADD type, brain type week, and how ADD impacts relationships, work, school. Tana said we didn't talk about how classic ADD impacts relationships or inattentive. In my book, Healing ADD, there's a chapter called The Games ADD People Play. And the first game they play is Let's Have a Problem. So unless it's treated properly, they're looking for stimulation. And, they can find it in scary movies. So, why does the movie Saw exist? But it's not just Saw. It's Saw 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 3D.
No, it's odd to me
and
that...
why did your mother take you to scary movies when you were a child?
The Hills Have Eyes and Silent Scream when I was like 8 and 9 years old. What is that? And she's like, well, I didn't know.
So, like they go after scary movies, they go to the edge in relationships.
Yep.
And they can be conflict seeking. And which means they play this game, Let's Have a Problem. And that wears out their partner. It's like we're on vacation, we're having a great time, and why are you picking on me? And it just happens over and over again, and their partners get worn out. So they can find stimulation and, oh, this is the most amazing relationship ever. But then a couple of hours later, change it into you did this, you did that.
So let me ask you a question, because this is, I think, a fairly practical thing people might be able to take away. So I know that was sort of my example growing up, and I think learned behavior also happens, chaos, you start to learn that. Maybe that combined with some ADD of my own or whatever. I thought that was normal. Like, I thought that was just sort of normal in relationships. And I remember when I first met you, I thought, okay, this is ridiculous. He's lying. Nobody's that nice. And I kept waiting for the other shoe to fall, right? I kept waiting. It took me like a year and a half before I trusted it. And then I remember I was going through therapy. I'm like, this just isn't, like, nobody's that nice. Like, he's trying to manipulate me somehow. I remember thinking that. And so over time, I dealt with my own stuff, and I realized, no, he's actually nice. There are nice guys, they're really nice. And so I sort of dealt with that. But the part that I want to point out is, number one, you have to recognize it, right? And recognize if you've gone through that, if that's been your example, it's not a crime to just go, okay, just acknowledge it, because you can't make it better unless you do. But the other thing is, having peace in your house is just so amazing. But you can channel that energy. If you know you've got that energy, I know I'm a little like one of those German shepherds that needs, those working dogs that need to be worked a lot. You always say, if I don't have a project, I'm dangerous. You'll come home and I'll have half of the back half of the house torn off. Or I will have ordered a new dog from Germany, right? I'll do something shocking. So, so I'm just like that. I know that about myself. I accept that. So what I do is I make sure that I'm engaged and involved in something that channels that energy. Martial arts for me is the perfect thing, right? Writing books, doing things like this, the podcast. I just know that I need that outlet so that I'm not bringing that into a relationship, right? Can't people do that and learn to do that?
Absolutely. And I think the older they get, especially if they're like you and they're introspective, right? For somebody like you, therapy is so helpful because you're bright and you think about it.
I want to be better.
And you want to be better. For someone where their problems are always somebody else's fault, therapy is not that helpful. right? So therapy doesn't help everybody. It helps a certain group of people. And I think, you've taken full advantage of it. And when I've done it for me, I take full advantage of it, right? We often say therapy is not for the weak person. It's for the strong
Definitely
person.
not. You're going to see parts of yourself that are
It's
naked that you're just like, whoa.
for the strong person. Okay, so classic ADD, the restlessness can really impact relationships. The interrupting, so the other person is not able to, because relationships require one, time, two, listening, and a lot of people have ADD. They're not good listeners because they're always afraid if I don't say what I'm thinking, I'm going to forget it, and because they get distracted easily. Classic ADD. I did an article once for Men's Health. I used to be a columnist for Men's Health, and I actually wrote a couple of feature articles for them. And one was 6 women wrote about the best sex of their lives. And I did the psychoanalysis of it. I mean, that was like so much fun.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's just like something I'm sure you did. Yeah, never mind.
That was so much fun for me.
Keep going.
But as I was reading about these like wild experiences, I'm like, oh, these are classic ADD women, right? It's like it's fun to write about. These are not women I would ever date,
right?
Because they would make
They're crazy,
your life
right?
a
They will
living
make
hell.
you crazy, yeah.
Right? Because it's hard for them to be settled,
right?
They're
going to move on, yeah.
Relationship. They're what we call montane bulls,
right?
Right?
You need to explain what that means. People are like, "What? What is he talking about?"
So they actually did this study on monogamy, and they actually did it on voles. Voles are little furry things. They look like prairie dogs. They're little rodents, and they're prairie voles, which if they mate with another prairie vole,
that's it.
80% of the time, even if their partner dies,
they're
the only vole they want. And
they mourn, right?
And they mourn. And then there's another one called montane bulls that are one-night stand artists. If they have sex
love the one you're with
another montane bull, it just doesn't matter one bit if that's the bull they have sex with the next time.
Right.
And so you have to sort of know who you are.
And your values need to line up with the person
stay with your species.
Because that can be dangerous.
And people with classic ADD more likely to be.
But maybe they don't want to be that, and maybe it's the ADD.
And if you treat the ADD,
they may be different.
They can be so much better at work, more focused in their
because you just got done talking about self-esteem, and maybe that person hates themselves for that, but they keep repeating a cycle because they don't know what else to do. So I'm just bringing something up that.
They don't know the underlying biology.
And because I know we see people who hate themselves, right? So
let's go on to type 4, which is classic ADD, inattentive ADD, overfocused ADD. Type 4, and I described this very early on with our imaging work, is one I called temporal lobe ADD. So you have temporal lobes underneath your temples, behind your eyes. They're very large structures in the brain, and they house the amygdala and the hippocampus. And when they're hurt, either from a head trauma or toxin, or you were born that way, mood instability, irritability, temper problems, learning problems, dark thoughts. And I would get all these kids who had rage attacks, and people thought it was bad parenting. But when I scanned them, they had trouble in their temporal lobes, and I actually found that anti-seizure medications just balance them out. Now, I often had to treat their ADD as well, but this is a very important.
This is important because with children, this is just tragic. But think about this with a partner. Of all the types of ADD you've talked about so far, from my perspective, from a female perspective, I don't know about from a male perspective, that would be the hardest one to deal with because the others are annoying, irritating, might not put up with it. That one, flat out dangerous, and that's just not going to happen.
It can
the temper. That one, but if someone behaves that way toward me, is not going to happen. Like the temper, the outrage, the violence. Yeah, no, that could be a recipe for disaster. So this one would be the hardest. And you tend to
I
label
think
them
for
as bad.
anybody it would be.
But you're going to label them as bad is my point.
Right. When in fact they're hurt.
Right.
And making that shift is dramatic.
So how...
Now, you often have to treat... So you treat the temporal lobes, and we often do it with an anti-seizure medicine. So Lamictal, Neurontin, Depakote, Trileptal, Topamax sometimes. And as it balances it, you often will then add either stimulating supplement or medication, and it can help so much.
So if someone's dealing with this, give them an idea how long it would take to get this treated before they see some kind of result, and what can they do in the process? Because that's kind of a scary one to me. So what can they do? Help me out.
A couple of weeks.
Okay. So get seen.
If you
suspect
have
this.
a scan, so that you know you have a map, right? That's why we scan people, to have a map, and then get on the right treatment. The best diet is a low carbohydrate, higher protein and fat diet. The ketogenic diet has actually been found to treat seizure disorders. I think of these almost like a storm going on in someone's brain, where they can be really great and then someone pokes them and they explode. And if they have it and they drink, it's really the prescription for disaster. So higher protein, lower carbohydrate diet, sometimes neurofeedback can be really helpful. Sometimes hyperbaric oxygen put the brain in a healing environment. But so many of the best stories I have are temporal lobe ADD kids that on the right treatment, or adults.
Yeah, because you see that transformation.
Just saved their life.
Yeah, that's transformational.
And it's a very important subtype. Type 5 is limbic ATD. That's a combination of both ADD and depression. And they don't do well with stimulants. In fact, stimulants often will work, but then they'll rebound. It'll cause them, when it wears off, to cry. And they are people, classic ATD people are often really happy. And, you know, once they get a bad thought, well, they got distracted from it and they went on to another thought. Limbic ATD people see the glass is half empty. So it's almost like they always have this low-grade depression. So they tend to be more socially isolated, more lonely, negative, a little bit like Eeyore. And they do better with SAMe, a stimulating supplement, or with Wellbutrin. So Wellbutrin, often miraculous for this type. And then, you know, early on, I actually didn't want to see this type. I didn't describe it for, I think, 5 years, because I would see it, but it didn't fit my idea of ADD. So people don't see things they're not looking for. And they didn't have low activity in their brain. They actually had high activity in their brain. The whole thing was overactive. And we call it the ring of fire.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I've seen these kids. Woo.
Yeah. And, you know, our friend Jared, it just transformed his life. Their brain's working way too hard. And you give them a stimulant.
Like an infection, right?
You give them a stimulant. In fact, if you give type overfocused a stimulant, they get more overfocused. You give temporal lobe a stimulant, you may actually could trigger the violence or trigger hallucinations. The limbic people can make them sad. The ring of fire people, they can just get more angry, OCD.
Violent.
I had one boy who became suicidal on it. And so the ring of fire is ADD plus really bad sensory integration thing. It's like the world comes at them way too quickly. Sometimes they have tics, often can go with Tourette's. And sometimes it's due to an infection, like a panda syndrome, which we can talk about.
So if I could just describe Jared from the perspective of a mother who had a little child. I didn't want my child around him, which is so hard for a mom to say, right? Because you have empathy for the other mother. You know that that's painful to another mother. But I was afraid for my daughter to be around him because she was younger than he was, significantly younger. And he was just this like whirlwind that would come into a room and you just knew something was going to like go wrong. He was just never very happy. And if he did go into a rage, he was going to like punch a hole in a wall or something. So it's this sort of very out of control. And it wasn't bad parenting. I knew it wasn't bad parenting. It was like, what is happening? And it's like this, like, it almost creates the sense of fear in people around.
And he'd been tried on 6 medications, and they wanted to put him on an antipsychotic.
Right.
When your friend, Christine, saw us on television.
Right. I hadn't seen her for a while, sort of part of it because of this.
And then she reached out to us, and we took him off all of his medication, put him on supplements, changed his diet, and it transformed his life.
Like significantly. But it's a scary thing to see.
Now, the last type is, and so Ring of Fire affects you in school. You're in the principal's office all the time. You're not able to focus because the world's coming at you.
He was always in trouble. No
You've
friends.
been diagnosed with ADD. You've been on a stimulant and you failed it.
And there's a good chance you don't have friends.
Thing yes. And so at work, you're often seen as a troublemaker. Mm-hmm. And in relationships, you tend to go through relationships because
not a lot of people are putting up with it.
Your partner is unhappy about your behavior. Now, the last type, and it's the type that gets diagnosed the least because they cover for it, and that's anxious ADD, where they have the ADD symptoms, but because they have a higher level of anxiety, as opposed to most kinds of ADD where they have a lower level of anxiety, in fact, maybe not enough anxiety, this type, their basal ganglia is really busy and their frontal lobes are sleepy. And so they have the core ADD symptoms, plus they can be anxious and tense and predict the worst. And so their level of anxiety keeps them on track, but it's at a great expense. So these would be the ICU nurses, the emergency room doctors, the trauma surgeons. The anxiety kept them, getting them through nursing school and medical school, but at a cost that it took them longer and with sort of greater effort.
Okay, so I think I have the anxious ADD. It didn't take me longer. That wasn't my problem. But when I went through and we said this in a different podcast, when I went through that really severe depression, because no one knew what was going on in my brain, they put me on Prozac.
And Prozac
that was
drops
a disaster.
Sleepy frontal lobes.
Right. I wasn't anxious anymore.
You weren't anxious anymore.
Disinhibited.
Which was not necessarily a good thing,
no.
right? Because we all need
because the anxiety is what was actually sort of keeping me on track. And so I think that if anything, that was when whatever ADD signs I had emerged. Fortunately, I took myself off of it pretty quickly, but I just knew I wasn't being me. I'm like, what is this? Like, that was never how I like thought or behaved.
Well, and that's why we really believe in first do no harm. What's the least toxic, most effective treatment? And for you, if they would have treated your thyroid effectively,
right,
and then treated the ADD, you
likely wouldn't have gone through that.
But now you know that, you can share this information for others. So I have a book, Healing ADD. It's sold like 500,000
great book. It's one of my
copies.
favorite books of yours, I just have to say.
Thank you. If you want to learn more about this, we also have a course that Tana and I did together called Healing ADD at Home in 30 Days. And we like it because it's like 5 to 10 minute videos segments on what are the things you can do right away. So you can get the book anywhere where great books are sold or on brainmd.com. You can get the course at amenuniversity.com. Stay with us. Use the code podcast10 to get a 10% discount on a full evaluation at amenclinics.com or on our supplements at brainmdhealth.com. Thank you for listening to the Brain Warriors Way podcast. go to iTunes and leave a review, and you'll automatically be entered into a drawing to get a free signed copy of The Brain Warrior's Way and The Brain Warrior's Way cookbook we give away every month.